So I'm going to assume that most of you have heard of the Honus Wagner event. To those of you who haven't, first of all, where the hell have you been? But second, one of the huge stories coming around in this week's news cycle is about a particularly unusual item that has been appearing on all kinds of online vendors such as eBay and Craigslist. That, of course, being the T206 Honus Wagner baseball card. So, if you're anything like me, your first response is, what the hell even is a Honus Wagner? I've never heard this word in my life. Which is a little bit unusual, seeing as he's not just like some guy. He's actually one of the greatest, if not the greatest, baseball players of all time. And while he has gotten a fair deal of publicity over the course of the past week or so with this event, that is actually not the subject of today's topic. Instead, we are talking about the same thing that lots and lots of people have been wondering over the course of the past week. Where did all these cards come from? In case you're not aware, the mint condition Honus Wagner has for a long time been the Ark of the Covenant of baseball cards. Nobody has one. Nobody knows where to find one. No one even knows if it exists. Yet it is still the most sought-after card in the history of baseball. Well, that used to be the case, but now, trying to find a mint-condition T206 Honus Wagner is about as difficult as trying to find a drop of water in the rain. That's right, these things are everywhere. And I really mean everywhere. We're talking hundreds, maybe even 1,000 or more of these ultra-rare cards. And as if that weren't bizarre enough, all of the cards that are listed, nearly all of the cards that are listed, are of incredibly high quality, when in the past it was almost impossible to find any card above a 5 or a 6 on the PSA's grading scale. So not only are all of these cards appearing seemingly out of nowhere, their quality is that of a card that has never seen the outside of a sleeve. So what's happening here? Well, there are a few theories. The most popular theory is the yard sale theory, which basically says somebody did not know the quality of these cards, they didn't know the value of these cards, they just sold them all for relatively cheap, and then whoever bought them is selling them again now. There are a lot of problems with this theory. For one, why are they being sold by different vendors? You would think someone who bought these with the plan to resell them would buy all of them, of course. Moreover, who is this source? I mean, if they were being sold by somebody, then you would expect that person to come forth when it's been all over the news recently. And if we're just talking like a warehouse full of baseball cards that some guys found, well, that's not a good enough answer either, because somebody had to have owned that, you know? And either way, someone who didn't know that he owned these cards managed to somehow keep them in mint condition for over a century. I think this theory just has too many holes. What I find much more interesting is the relationship between this theory and the SLM theory. So I know that not many people have heard of the SLM, so in order to make this a little bit easier to understand, we'll be framing this in regards to two other more popular theories that have similar ideas. First, I'd like to talk about the Wahlberg theory for a second, which is, it's sort of a joke, and most people see it as a joke, but there are actual adherents to it. I'm not making this up. There are people who legitimately believe that Mark Wahlberg is like a century old, or actually it's more than a century, it's like a millennium. So for those of you who don't have any idea what I'm talking about, the Wahlberg theory basically says there are lots of really old pictures of people who look similar to Mark Wahlberg, and there are lots of paintings of people who look similar to Mark Wahlberg that date up to 1,000 years old. And as if that weren't bad enough, Mark Wahlberg himself, if you take a picture from 20 years ago of him and compare it to a picture of him today, he doesn't seem to have aged at all. So a lot of people sort of jokingly put forth the theory that maybe Mark Wahlberg is like an ageless demon that's existed for 1,000 years. And like I said, there are people who legitimately think that could be true. Now, alternatively, you have the South Africa theory, which is just absolutely insane. Its first premise is that there are tons of things that humans just en masse remember incorrectly. The theory gets its name from a misconception that many people have, which is that Nelson Mandela was at some point president of South Africa. An example that more listeners might relate to because they might have made this mistake themselves at some point is because Stain is a very common suffix to last names and Steen is not. Lots of people believe that the children's book series Berenstain Bears was ever called the Berenstain Bears. In fact, a lot of people believe this so fervently that they assume that the title must have changed at some point. Now, I don't lay much stock in either of these theories. I think that they're both pretty flawed. However, they lay the groundwork for SLM, the theory that we're going to be talking about, which stands for Strange Little Man. Now, the reason that I'm so dismissive of the Wahlberg theory is that Mark Wahlberg is a pretty normal-looking guy, isn't he? I mean, he's a celebrity, so he ages gracefully better than most people, which is probably why he still looks the same as he did when he was younger. But on top of that, there are going to be lots and lots of people who look like him throughout the ages because there's nothing unusual about him. But what if there were a historical figure who, over the past 1,000 years, has appeared in many photographs, portraits, and illustrations, who is recognizably the same in each of them, and who, above all, has distinguishing figures he's unlikely to share with anyone else on Earth? That would be pretty strange, right? Well, it just so happens that there is. The SLM, or Slim, is notable for his very short stature, his sunken facial features, his pointed ears, and his unusual fashion sense. And he is a figure who is much more prominent in history than you might expect. He's appeared in photos of the Kennedy assassination. He's appeared in Chinese watercolors from like 200 AD. Peter Bruegel, a Dutch Renaissance painter, painted a portrait that looks exactly like this guy. And oh yeah, he's also appeared in a photograph with Honus Wagner. Now, maybe I'm just being crazy here, but the odds that someone like this has existed throughout the entirety of human history, I find unlikely. Mostly because he doesn't even look like a human. I doubt anyone that looks like this is alive now. Well, except for him. So this is a guy who is clearly not bound by the same temporal restrictions as the rest of us. Do you see where I'm going with this? Let's take a step back and ask ourselves precisely why the Honus Wagner cards were so valuable in the first place. The answer is, there never were very many of them. For some bizarre reason, the American Tobacco Company chose to print tons and tons of cards for players who were way less memorable than Honus Wagner. Or at least, that's what you would think at first. What if there really were lots and lots of copies of the T206, but they all went missing? And yes, I know, I've already discounted the possibility that somebody was storing them away somewhere for an extended period of time. That's not what I mean. What I mean is, and hear me out, someone moved the cards from one position in time to another. That is to say, someone who knew that T206 Honus Wagner cards were very valuable went backwards in time to their first printing and brought hundreds of mint condition cards into the future to sell them. Now I know it sounds far-fetched. It is far-fetched. But we do have evidence supporting SLM and, as a result, supporting this theory. Because I believe that the little strange man is the one who came forward into the future and sold all of these cards. And now the people he sold them to are trying to resell them on the internet. Now, I'm no physicist. I don't quite understand how it works. But apparently, someone has found a hole. A hole that can move an object from one point in physical space to another without having to traverse the distance in between those two spaces. And again, I don't know how that's possible. But if it is, I would like to point out that time and space are the same thing. If it's possible for something to travel through space, which we know it is, then it's also possible for something to travel through time. which would explain the SLM theory. But you know what's really funny about that is if all of this is true, it means somebody really screwed himself. They retroactively made the Honus Wagner cards valuable by limiting their supply in the past, while also making them worthless in the present by producing them in abundance. In other words, if these cards were never valuable, then nobody would have gone back in time to get them, and if nobody had gone back in time to get them, they would never have been valuable. It's a paradox, which might poke a hole in my theory, but personally, I think it's still possible. Anyway, strange little man theory. Look it up. You will be stuck in that rabbit hole for days.